Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Vuhledar, and in this one we start in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have managed to advance in two directions towards the town. In the north towards Vodyane, capturing the entirety of the village, and in the south crossing the river line north of Pavlivka, south of Vuhledar. The Russians are here launching two operations at the same time. They're getting a foothold to strengthen the position north of Pavlivka and secure the Dacha area to the northeast and the greenhouse area in the northwestern parts, where they've managed to gain a foothold in the greenhouse area. The Russians here, with this geolocated footage, are fighting from building to building. The river itself here across the northern bank of Pavlivka is hardly noticeable. It is not a significant village, and the Russians or Ukrainians can cross through at any point. This has led the Russians to launch an offensive across it towards the greenhouse area to gain a foothold and secure a crossing across the river line towards Vuhledar. This, combined with the recent advances by the Russians to the east of Vuhledar, has allowed them to gain control over a large span of areas that are outside the direct range of Vuhledar, the Ukrainian positions within it, where their positions right now are pretty close to what they were at the height of the offensive operations in late January, early February of 2023. At that point, they had control over the Dacha area to the east of Vuhledar. The Russians now have a much greater control in the eastern and northern flank of Vuhledar, while the western flank is practically the same. The difference is the Russians now have control over Przeciwstawka, which gives them a strong western flank as well. This means that currently the Russians are looking to improve the positions further in the west, which would be a push towards Novoukrainka. The Ukrainians have several fortified positions to the south of the village, which means it will be a difficult push towards that village. But at the same time, the Russians have full control over the forest lines to the east of Vuhledar, and now with the crossing to the south of it, they could repeat a similar offensive to the one they did a year and 8 months ago, where the repeat of the same would not be exactly the same, as currently the Ukrainian defenses in Vuhledar are weaker. The Russian offensive capabilities have increased, with the FAB bombs being mass-produced and massively used. At the same time, the Russians now have much of the supply lines around Vuhledar cut off. I believe the operations here isn't to launch a direct assault towards Vuhledar, but to cut off the southern road connecting Vuhledar with the south towards the northern positions and all the way up to Bohuyavlinka. We currently see, with the Russian advance in the direction of Vodyane and the control of the village, to then a push towards the coal mine would lead to the Russians having physical control over this road connecting here north of the coal mine. So we see that there is the industrial zone of the coal mine and the coal mine itself, both are named the coal mine. So we see this road here connected all to Bohuyavlinka is within such close proximity that the Russians have direct fire control over the road. This means that the current positions of the Ukrainians in Vuhledar is either they can go to the southwest along the road towards the north, where it will be a safe road for the majority of it. They just need to get to this road, or they can go through the northern road, which connects here north of Vuhledar, and then along towards Bohuyavlinka. And then there's the third road, which goes through the south of the coal mine to the second coal mine, and then up to Bohuyavlinka. This means that 2 out of 3 supply roads are within close proximity to the Russian positions. This means that these supply roads would be under direct fire of Russian soldiers, whether it is artillery, tanks, other guns, ATGMs, and so on. This means vehicles driving through would be shot at. The only secure road is the one directly connected to the north of Vuhledar all the way to Bohuyavlinka, which is further away. But if the Russian offensive continues north of Vodyane towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians and the road connected to the north of Vuhledar, they can get fire control of that and cut off physically the second supply road in the north, combined with an assault to the south where they could get complete control over that road here, physical control of it. the Russians would be in a position where they would have operationally encircled Vuhledar, and they could continue to push towards the fortified positions to gain control over those. Therefore, I believe the current operation of the Russians in the north of Vuhledar is to gain control over the fortified positions east and south of Bohoyavlenka, together with control over the coal mines, both the southern and northern ones, and physical control over the crossing here south of Vuhledar, to completely cut off supplies to and from Vuhledar, force a withdrawal of Ukrainian soldiers from Vuhledar through the open fields where they would be under fire by Russian artillery and FAB bombs. Therefore, we can conclude that the current situation for the Ukrainians is very difficult, but there is still this large gap that the Russians have yet to advance through, and that is the fact that the Ukrainians still have all of these fortified positions south and east of Bohoyavlenka, and this is mostly open fields, which means that the Russians would be exposed attacking in this direction. There's nowhere to hold on to. Capture of Vodyane is within close proximity of the road between Konstantinivka and Vuhledar. Russians could launch an operation directly south from it now that they have secured the road for themselves, gain control over the coal mine, and launch a direct assault, which would be a repeat of the former offensive in January of 2023. However, the situation would be greatly improved, both with the amount of weapons they have, the defenses of Vuhledar being weakened, and the increase in both supply routes and manpower that can be used for the battle. However, that would be a very costly battle, similar to that of January 2023. Therefore, it is more likely that they will continue a push to the north and completely ignore Vuhledar until they deem that Vuhledar has been weakened enough that they can take it without heavy losses. Therefore, I believe that the Russians have learned from their mistakes and that it is only a matter of time for Vuhledar to fall, considering how isolated it currently is from any other settlements nearby, and how most of their supply routes have been physically cut off or have come under Russian fire control. Moving further north in the direction of Toretsk, the Russians have managed to capture the Crescent to the east of Toretsk. This allows Russians to gain control over a heavily fortified position of the Ukrainians, which was this prison. This is also confirmed with this geolocated footage of the Russians having possessions and gained advances here to the west of it. The Ukrainians still have control over the high ground, the Toretsk hill here to the east of Toretsk, which means that the Ukrainians still have a defense within it, and the eastern parts of it, they also still have a presence within the forest area. Until the Russians gain control over both of these, there will be no massive assault into Toretsk itself. However, I believe that once the Russians have control over the forest area and the Toretsk hill, now that they've gained control over the prison area, they'll secure the eastern and northern flanks to then push into the southern parts, where they will look to gain control over the southern parts, the hills to the west of Toretsk, and the industrial zone in the central parts, connecting that with a push along the highway towards the central parts with the apartment complex buildings and the heaviest defenses of the Ukrainians within the city itself, which will lead to the Russians having full control over the city, as the remaining parts of the city are insignificant in comparison to the central and southern parts of it, which are heavily defended. It would be similar to the Russian control over Krasnoarivka, where we see that once the Russians captured the apartment complex buildings and industrial area in the central parts of the city could be considered under Russian hands despite the Ukrainian presence in the residential areas to the north of the city, as there would be no hope for the Ukrainians to recapture the city, with the Russians having full control over the industrial area unless they launched a proper counterattack similar to that of the Kursk offensive. But with this, we see that these are the changes in the eastern front. In the Kursk direction, the Ukrainians have managed to recapture Spelnoe after being pushed out of it a couple of weeks ago. So we've seen that a lot of positional fighting has happened here in the south, where the Russians had managed to recapture Spelnoe and Borki, but then was pushed out of both of these villages with another Ukrainian offensive operation in this direction. What happened in the Kursk direction is that the Ukrainians led their initial push into Sutsha and towards Koronevo. The fight towards Koronevo failed, while the one towards Sutsha succeeded. This led to further Ukrainian advances north, east, and southeast of Sutsha. into Russian territory much further and deeper than they had gone before. This led to the Ukrainians reaching all the way to Belaya. However, the Russians counterattacked and managed to regain control over the majority of the southeastern front of Sucha. The Ukrainians saw that they were losing the initiative in Kursk as the Russians started counterattacks all throughout the front line from Koronevo in the northwest to Belaya in the southeast. So they introduced a new wave of units, both the remaining parts of the units they had already introduced, as well as additional units to build fortifications and defensive positions within the Kursk region, and additional assault units to pick up the slack of the units that were damaged at that point. So we saw a second wave of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive starting, and now we're seeing the results of this with the additional pushes by the Ukrainians, recapturing some positions they had lost to a Russian counterattack and capturing new positions in the north and east of Sucha. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.